First that bar of colour, nice and thick, dropping the paint in, then dipping our brush, just the tip, in our water, using the more dilute colour. And watercolour pigments, being inquisitive, we'll start getting that colour drawn down so that finally we can use our brush, give it a good old rinse, wet but not dripping, and just pull that colour down with our water to get that gradient. And so once I've got these three gradients, I'll just wait a minute, just in case we've got any that we're finishing up. Once I've got that, I'm then going to do the same thing, but in reverse, so that our two colors can get introduced to one another. So I'm going to start with the gradient that I painted first and that will have had the colors given the most time to settle, which is my purple one up here. Which color am I going to mix with it? Well, I think I'm going to go for, and again, I'm sure you'll all have a variety of colors. I'm just going to go for this pink here. Just exactly the same thing, but in reverse. Just load up the brush, nice thick amount of color. And then around the very faintest edge of our purple, of our color number one, I'm just going to do the same thing, paint that thick old band of color. And where it looks a bit uneven, I might just drop in some color. Quite a lot of paint is going to sit on the paper, but that's okay, because we're going to pull it around, spread it out, dip our brush in water once, and then again going in the other direction, half on, dragging that paint back. And then with a brush that's completely clear of paint and just loaded with a little bit of water, pulling that pink into that purple. And we're getting a little bit of a paleness in the middle of our gradient here because we're using that watery brush. So we're just going to go over the purple again, just quickly, just doing the same thing. Just restating, getting those two colors to have a good old conversation, get to know each other, pop some color down here. Slightly wet brush. And then a brush just loaded with water. And we can see now that there's a real sort of mid-range of colors coming in here. So I'm just going to do the same thing with my second color. Keep on introducing them to each other, keep on getting them mixing. And then I'm just going to do that for my other two colors. I'm going to pick a color that I think would look nice with them. And I'm just going to gradient into them, get them to shake hands a couple of times.
Did you find your things then? Hmm? Hello.
So once I've done those, I'll just wait a moment, just a minute while we finish off any that we're still doing. And then we're going to just have a think about the second technique that we're going to use today. And for that technique, we'll want our smaller brush. So I'm going to rinse off my medium-sized brush and just set that down. And I'm going to get to hand my, well, I've got a size 4. Anything around that size will do fine. Okay, so now that we've got our small brush, the other thing we're going to have a think about is painting very fine lines. And to do that, we're going to be doing wet on dry, but we're going to be making sure that we've got quite thick paint, because if the paint is dilute, of course, it'll spill out, it'll explore, and we want it to stay quite tight and controlled. So I'm going to wake up my brush, give it a good swirl in the water. Then the clean water, and just make sure it's wet but not dripping. And then I'm going to pick a color and pick this sort of forest green here, but I'm going to really spend quite a while just running it back and forth and loading it with paint, because the more pigment gets sort of activated that way, the thicker the paint becomes and the easier it'll be to paint quite a fine, controlled line with a relatively dry brush. So I'm spending more time back and forth picking up pigment than I would normally, making especially sure that the point of the brush is loaded with that pigment. And then we're just going to practice doing a little bit of cross-hatching, just trying to get just with the very tip of that brush, that very fine line. Once I've got a few hatches one way, I might just put a bit more of this very concentrated paint on my brush and just try crossing them. When the brush gets a wee bit dry, I'm just going to rinse it in some water and put some more paint on it. So once we're comfortable with doing that, I think it's time that we had a look at our picture for today, at our blue tit, and how we're going to apply these skills to create him. On my picture, we've got this delightful spot of discoloration here where I've spilt coffee on my blue tit and it's become lime green in one place, but we're not going to imitate that. We're going to have a look at some of the colors that we've got going on here. We're going to have a look at the way that our dark blue on this head here sort of fades into the white of his face here. We've got a sort of gradient, haven't we, from a full concentrated yellow through to a darker sort of color. And then as the plume mixes with the blue, we've got almost a green sort of color here. We've also got this very fine sort of feathered edge, haven't we? Sort of as though he's been combed from the beak outwards. We can see everything sort of pointing towards the top of his head here. So we can get that effect using our relatively dry brush with some fine lines just to suggest that feathering. With our relatively dry small brush as well, we can get these really nice clear bits of dark plumage here separating some of the flight feathers, some of those straight arrow straight lines there. So with that in mind, I'm going to take off my rough bit of paper. I'm going to get myself a fresh bit of paper.
Can I ask you a quick question, please, Felix?
Yes, Pat, hi.
The paper is, one side is slightly creamier in colour than the other. The one side is slightly whiter. Which one is the best to use?
Oh, right. Well, I haven't got any difference between the two of mine, so I would say whichever you fancy. Is one of them sort of white and one of them off-white for you?
Well, it's a slightly different texture as well. This is the new lot that we've just received, and it's a fractionally different texture, that side to that side.
Would you say that one side is rougher than the other? Can you see more
Yes.
sort of bumps and things?
Yes.
Okay.
I think it's the whiter side is smoother and the slightly creamer side is a fraction rougher. It's only a fraction in it, but
Okay. Well, thank you very much for telling me that, because I'm using paper from the first set of sheets
yeah,
that was given out, so I
Yeah.
wasn't aware of that. I would say that we'll want to use the slightly rougher paper for today.
yeah. Okay, doke. Thank you very much.
Thank you for letting me know. So I'm gonna just take my paper down, and as we do so, we're just gonna have a look at the proportions of our blue tit, because I always think songbirds are a great way to get a feel for how to proportion things, because we've got these different areas of bright color, but we're not distracted by any preconceptions of what those might look like. So we're able to just draw them as we see them and get the relations between those different areas of color quite nicely. So let's have a look. We've got this area of blue here. We've got this nice sort of almost like a framework of dark blue here. We've got our swoop down of yellow here. And then we've got a blue section, a sort of like a sideways teardrop shape that lays on top of the yellow, nestles in, making a little point here with the dark blue of the head, and then coming out, tapering to a flat point, we've got the tail feathers. Now, as those of you who've been with me for the last 4 weeks will remember, something I'm always boring you with is the idea that we start with our lighter colors first, and then we paint on the darker. So we're going to start with the yellow, I think. And for our yellow, I reckon our lemon yellow is a good bet. So, bearing in mind the sort of shape, and the great thing with starting with the light colors is that they're going to get painted over with the dark. So we can afford to be a little bit inexact. We want to get the right shape, we want to get the right proportion, but if we don't get that boundary precisely as we'd like it, then we can just gently paint over it when we do the darker colors on top. So keeping a close eye on exactly what the bit of color looks like, because we're just painting color here. We want to forget that we're painting a blue tit, daft though that sounds. We want to forget that we're painting a representation of something and just focus on getting the color down as it appears. So with our lemon yellow, I'm going to load my brush up.
Felix, what size brush are you using?
Oh yeah, sorry, I'm using my medium sized again, so my number 8, although number 6 would work just as well. Just something that'll give us a bit of control while at the same time letting us get a large amount of paint down. Yes, no, please don't stick with your tiny brush, or you'll be here all day, don't worry.
Okay.
And so I'm going to begin, like I said, I always like to sort of draw with the brush. So I'm going to start by just gently sort of sketching the curve of our blue tit's belly. So let's have a look. It sort of goes like this, doesn't it? Again, we can be wonderfully rough because we don't want a photocopy, we don't want a facsimile of this photo that I've sent you. We want a painting of a blue tit. So as long as I'm capturing the sort of form of this belly here as it comes down, then we're okay. And I think at this point we've sort of hit the legs. So I might just, more as a mark of myself than anything else, just sort of skirt around them. And now we're going to lay some other colors on top of this yellow when we come to do the sort of dark gradients and things on our blue tit's belly and on his lower bit. But I'm just going to lay down a nice bit of yellow to start off with. And then at the top here, we've got a sort of collar, haven't we? So let's just sort of get that shape in. reloading our brush when we become a wee bit dilute. This wing is dark as anything, so if we want to change the shape slightly, we've got the luxury of being able to do so. And I'm just gonna leave that section there for the time being. So we've got a lot of blue coming in ahead of there. And now that I've got that, I'm just gonna get a brush that's nicely loaded with lemon yellow. It can be a little bit more dilute than it was just then. And then using these very gentle side of the brush, sideways strokes, back and forth. No pressure at all. Not trying to push the paint onto the paper. We're just trying to pull it over it. I'm just going to pull the paint around and fill in the color of our blue tit's belly. So once I've got that shape down, I'm just going to pause for a moment just so that we're all happy that we've got that sort of belly shape down. Are we happy that we've got that shape, or would anyone like just a little bit longer?
That's fine, thank you.
I'm fine, thank you, Felix.
Yes,
Okay.
thank you.
Okay, brilliant. So with that shape, we're now going to look at our next lightest color, and I think that's the sort of the blue here that we've got, this lighter shade of blue that we've got on the top of the head and on our avian friend's shoulders there. So for that, I reckon that we can use our marine blue, which is in my palette. It's just that fella there.
Could I have a look again, Felix? I missed that. Just looking at just point out where it is on your
Yes.
palette.
Now, Carol, does your palette have two little sort of niches in the middle of it?
It does.
It does, yes. That's the thing. So Teresa's told me about this. The company we get these from has changed their specifications and reference numbers. So we've had some slightly different palettes through.
Oh.
So not to worry. Do you have a sort of, well, first of all, you might see there's a color sheet
Yes,
like
I've got
this.
it. Yes,
Fantastic.
I've got it.
Have you got a marine blue?
No.
Not a problem. If you have a sort of relatively dark, rich blue like this, then that's good. If I were you, I'd have a look at the shoulders and the top of the head of our blue tit and have a think about which color in your palette looks like that. Because like I say, we're not after, replicas here. We're just looking for.
I mean, there's a turquoise color that possibly could do it.
Okay, well, if you'd be happy using that.
I mean, it's not going to look exactly like the picture, but that's not the point. I'm sure my picture's not going to look exactly like anything by the time I finish, but
Well,
never mind.
it'll be yours. That's what matters. And the wonderful thing is, of course, that I'm not doing it now, Carol, because I know that you've just joined. But of course, in other sessions, we've mixed colors, and that's always a very great way of getting the color that we want when we want to be a bit more precise.
Yes.
But another reason that I think a blue tit or a songbird is great fun is because there's not that much color mixing that needs to happen because the plumage is so bright, it's so vivid.
Yes.
We can go with the colors as we've been given them. So I'm happy to hear that you've got a color that will approximate. Thank you for bearing with us.
No problem at all. Keeping up just, I think.
Great. So again, now what I'm going to do here is I'm going to load my brush up. And we'll have seen that there's a sort of feathered edge, isn't there? It's not a smooth edge between the blue of our blue tit's shoulder and the yellow of his belly. The feathers of the yellow are sort of coming in over the blue. And that's something that I'm going to want to replicate with a small brush, but I don't want to do that yet. So I'm going to keep the blue and the yellow away from each other. As we know, these guys are very sociable, so they'll just start mixing together if we get them too close. So I'm just going to, with a fairly dilute brush, just get them fairly near, just so that we've laid down this area of color. And we can see that around the time when this curve here starts plateauing out, we've got that little flash of white. So I'm just going to follow that up. One thing to note is these things here where the brush lifts off and we get a little dot of color, pigment that's been left behind by surface tension. Those we call blooms, and they're sometimes very unwelcome. And a nice way to get rid of those is just to wash your brush completely clean. Get it with water, then get it relatively dry. And then just with a dry brush, just take up some of that paint. Just scoop up that bloom to get a more even finish. And now if we're happy that we've got our shoulder down, I'm just going to pick a slightly lighter, slightly more turquoise color. And Carol, please feel free to use the same color, because I understand you're maybe got less of a choice than the rest of us, but I'm just going to use this color here, which I think is called turquoise on these palettes. And I'm just going to use it for the color that's underlying these sharp flight feathers here. And that's the great thing about starting with the light colors, is that we can just paint a complete block of color and sort of that wedge shape extending way out over here. We can paint that block of color, and then we can worry about adding in those darker lines once this is dried. So I'm just going to do that now. again, leaving a bit of a gap. What with watercolors being so notoriously sociable, often that's a good thing. But here we've got quite a crisp edge, so we want to avoid them mixing too much if we can help it. And you'll again see that, yeah, we can be quite imprecise here because it's going to get covered over with the dark of the lines in those flight feathers. It's just a matter, I don't know about anyone else, but the sight of a blank canvas always really spooks me, and I like to get down some blocks of color. I like to know where I am. And as soon as I've got those reference points, I feel much more comfortable adding in things and working on details. So I'll just wait a moment just so that we're all happy that we've got those blocks of color down. And then I think I'm going to start on the head. So once we've got those blocks of color, I'm just going to have a look at the shade that we've got here. It's a very dark blue, isn't it? But it is blue. So what I think I might do is get my marine blue and chuck a bit of black in with it in my palette. But of course, I think you'd be just as well to just get one of our midnight blues. I think just as long as we can get that dark blue, we'll be happy. So if you'd like to have another practice of mixing colors, then we can chuck some black in with our marine blue, but otherwise one of our midnight blues should do just fine. And so as ever, I'm going to lift up a bit of paint from my marine blue. I'm going to chuck it in my palette quite forcefully because paint likes to come off again. Load the palette up.
What?
And rinsing my brush completely, I'm just going to drop in a little bit of black. And then I'm just going to gently paint this sort of collar that we've got here. And again, I'm not worrying too much about the exact slightly feathered point where those color blocks meet yet, because we're going to work on that with a small brush with fairly dry paint in just a bit. And this is a very handy, this is a very obliging evolutionary feature of the blue tip, that it's got this lovely little frame almost, framing its cheeks and running through its eyes, just so that watercolorists can be sure that they've got the proportions right. I'm going to leave a little gap for our eye there, which is very dark, so I think we can use black there. And once we got that down, I think I'm just going to do a tonal gradient for this little blue cap that our fella's got on his head. I always think it's a big leap of faith doing pictures like these, where you get these blocks of indiscriminate color, and while they're sitting apart from one another on the paper, they don't look like a great deal, but as soon as they start coming together and as soon as we start joining them together, the picture starts to appear, and it's always very satisfying. So just starting off, doing our gradient. I'm going to look closely at the picture. Where is it darkest? Well, it's darkest sort of at the top right. We've got a real dark spot here. So I'm going to start off dropping my color in here, at the same time paying attention to the shape of our little fella's head. I think that's how I'm going to start. And then I'm going to do the same thing that we did with our gradients. I'm just going to dip my brush, just the tip, in my water.
All colour are you using there, Felix?
Oh, sorry, I'm using marine blue here.
Well, it is. It looks, I thought so, but it looks a lot darker on the screen somehow.
Yes, no, I
Yeah.
agree, absolutely. And also, I mean, if it looks dark when we're painting, we don't need to worry because I'm just making sure that I load a huge amount down here. We can see it's all there with the surface tension holding it there. And then we're just going to be dragging it out as we do our gradient. So yes, with our marine blue. Just gently looking at how the picture looks, how that color fades away from this dark point, and just pushing and shoving our watercolor around just to get that effect. There's a bit of a lighter patch here as well, isn't there? So I'm just going to try and get that. Just with a slightly dilute brush. Then I'm going to rinse my brush off entirely. And we all know the drill. A brush that's loaded with nothing but water, wet but not dripping. I'm just going to have a play, push and pull that water around, push and pull the pigment until I'm happy that I get something like the gradient that we've got. Maybe I'm going to draw some of this pigment out here with my wet brush. And then while I've got marine blue, or whichever blue I'm using on my brush, while I'm in the area, while I'm in the neighborhood, I'm just going to pick up on a couple of other points.
Motion detected at the front door.
And one of those is the bill here. We've got a sort of, oh dear, handy impromptu reminder of how we get unwanted paint off our canvas by getting a bit of our kitchen roll, dabbing it in clean water, and just carrying that paint off. As I was saying, Butterfingers, we just want to get that sort of dark shadow on top of our bill there. So I'm just going to load my brush with marine blue and just get that down. And I've left a sort of space here in this frame almost, so I know where I'm putting that little wedge. And also with my marine blue, since the area around there is dried, I'm just going to add in the very end tail feathers. Just this area here where we come under this bit and we swoosh along dead straight. And I run into my masking tape a bit. Hopefully you won't. There we go. And once I've done that, as we're just filling in our starting blocks of colour, I'm going to finish with the very darkest. And here I think I can switch to a slightly smaller brush. And that's going to be the bits of black. Bits of very, very dark flight feather, dark blue. So I'm going to have a go, first of all, at this area over here. Like I say, we could use very, very dark blue. I think maybe I'll use black. But now that this area has dried a little bit, I'm going to load my brush. I'm going to do the same thing that we did when we were practicing. I'm going to load it up. And I'm going to make sure that I spend a little longer than normal harrying around in that pigment, just so that we've got a very dry brush that can produce some very crisp lines, making especially sure that we're loading up the very tip of our small brush. I'm using a number 4 here. And now I've left a little white flurry here for that little flash there, so I think I'm just going to start painting around it. And now finally we can start filling in some of these gaps. Some of these gaps between the blocks of colour get filled in, first of all, with our black, or indeed with our very dark blue. And again, we can try and count the number of those dark lines that there are. How many are there? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 or so before they start sort of blurring into the darker bits at the top of there. So I'm going to do roughly a half dozen of these dark lines once I've filled in the sort of dark base of these little feather edges. Just going to cover up this rough edge here. I'm turning my brush as I go just to make sure that paint from every side gets put onto the paper before I need to reload. And once I've done that, I'm just going to fill in this area here. And then I'm going to have a look at our eye and our bill, what I think we can do with a bit of black as well. And for our eye, I'm just going to have a look. Just going to have a look at the way that sits. Unless I can wait another minute or so if people would like to just finish off those flight feathers. I can wait for a moment longer. Are we ready to have a think about the eye and the beak here?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, so just with a brush that a small brush again that I'm going to load with black, I'm going to have a look at the eye, and it's not a uniform black because it being spherical, we've got this bit of reflected sky here. Can we see a reflected image of the photographer in the black mirror of our blue tit's eye? Not quite. So bearing that in mind, with my very dark black, really working that into the brushes, I'm just going to paint the lower half of a semicircle like this, making sure to drop as much black in as I can to get that very dark. Just round that out. And while I've got my concentrated black on my brush, I'm just going to do the shadow of the bill there and maybe just a very gentle outline. I'm using the words bill and beak interchangeably, but they probably have very different biological meanings, don't they? I think of bigger birds as having bills. Platypuses and storks have bills. Maybe there's a size requirement, I don't know. Anyway, this thing here that he eats with, just going to pop that shadow in, just on its underside there. There's a shadow along the bottom that joins into the dark of that little plumy frame. Then there's a very subtle line where the two halves join. And so just applying no pressure at all, getting a fine, hair fine line with my small brush. And now I'm just going to join those up, just like that. And now I'm going to just do top half, the outline of the top part of our little fella's eye. And then with a slightly dilute black brush, I'm just going to pull a little bit of pigment in to make that slightly lighter top half. And maybe I'm going to use a brush that's loaded with nothing but water, but fairly dry, just to lift some pigment off selectively. Just to get that 3D effect. And then I'm going to chuck a very thin black line around that eye. And now I always like to move around, just making sure that when we're painting on top of dried color, we've given it time to dry. So I'm now going to paint some of those edges of the flight feathers on his tail here. Again, with my brush that's loaded with black, quite concentrated. And so now, just once we're ready, I'm just going to wash my brush off. And now what we're going to have a think about is how we join up some of these areas of color that are neighbors, but don't quite feel like they're really joined in the way that they are in our picture. So I'm just going to wash my brush off using the same small brush. I'm using a number 4. I'll just wait a moment so we're all at the same page. So if we're all ready, I'm just going to take my small brush with my marine blue here, because the first thing we're going to attend to is this line here. We've kept these two apart long enough that our yellow is now well and truly dry. So we can just paint that sort of slightly jagged, feathered outline using our small brush marine blue, using the tip of it comme ça, just to get that nice join. So I'm going to load it up with marine blue, pretty concentrated. And just with the point of the brush facing into the belly there, getting the shape that we want to achieve. I'm just going to start layering in some of that, some of those sort of serrated edges. And don't forget, as we do this, it'll look darker than what you've got down already. But this is because watercolor has a tendency to get lighter as it dries.
At about half an hour. I'll phone her back.
I'm just doing this just so that we make sure we pull a bit of color in, make sure that we dry nice and evenly. And now we're just going to have a look, once we've done that, once we've got that feathered edge, have a look at some of our color gradients that we've got going on the shadowing on this belly here. We've got a sort of shadow that means we fade into a darker yellow. I think we should be able to achieve that by getting maybe the same yellow that we did before, but with something to darken it, maybe with some yellow ochre. So I'm going to get our medium-sized brush again. I'm using a number 8. And I'm just going to use one of my palette spots just to mix yellow ochre and lemon yellow. That's our fella in the top right here. And then this one here.
Yellow ochre, and what was the other colour you suggested?
And
Felix?
lemon yellow, but if whatever yellow you use to paint this fella's belly should do just fine.
Okay, I've got so both of them together.
That's right. So what I'm doing is I'm just going to drop some lemon yellow into my palette first of all, and then I'm just going to mix some yellow ochre in just to get the color of that shadow that we've got on the bottom of our blue tit's belly. More lemon yellow than yellow ochre, of course, because we can start off nice and light. It's not too difficult to make it get darker, but it's rather trickier to make it get lighter. So I'm just going to drop a whole lot of lemon yellow in here before then adding in my yellow ochre. Now, once I've got a color that I'm happy with, that I think will approximate that shade, I'm going to have a look at my picture. I'm going to ask myself, well, where is it darkest? And it's darkest right here at the bottom, just in front of the legs, isn't it? Sort of there. We've got the center of our darkness. So bearing in mind what we did with our gradients, I'm just going to do the same from there. I'm going to start off there. I'm going to paint in this shadow color. Rather conveniently for us, it sort of extends to the end of this fella's belly, so I can just pop it in like that, following roughly the trace of where I'm going to put the legs. I'm just going to extend it. And it sort of runs a little way up here, doesn't it? And it's one of the luxuries of watercolor that as we paint, our brush naturally gets more dilute. So as we paint outwards from that sort of color epicenter, we naturally get a lighter sort of color. And maybe I'll use a near paintless brush just to work some of it in like that. And then I think I'm just going to get a brush that is loaded with a little more of this stuff. Just going to finish that shadow very gently, nice and subtle. And then maybe with a brush that's just loaded with water, I'll just want to push some of that pigment around. Just with water, but not too much. Don't want to drown our blue tit here. Maybe just shove some of this pigment around, blur some of it in. Just as much as we think is necessary. And then maybe I'll add in a little bit more of this dark color, because it really does get quite shadowed right in front of the leg there. So I'm just going to chuck some of that in, just for good measure. Now that we've done that, I'm just going to have a look at this tail end here, because we've got blue plumage that is really overlaid with yellow. Are they hairs? Are they the ends of very fine feathers? Well, we've got this sort of webbing overlay. And we're going to do that with a very fine brush. So I'm just going to drop some of that down before we then practice that sort of overlaying, just on this section of shoulder here, where we can see that very fine web of yellow plumage poking through. So just reloading with fairly dilute. I'm going to use marine blue, but whichever blue we've used for the shoulders and the tail here. And I'm just going to drop a patch of that down. Leaving a lighter section there where we've got that flash of white. Again, remembering that we're just laying down a sort of base color here. We're going to work over that with a little bit of overgo with yellow. Now I've just noticed the time, and see, I think time runs differently when I run these classes. I don't know if anyone else gets the same impression, but I see we've only got about 3 minutes left. So I'm going to quickly show what I had planned for this yellow, which is getting a very small brush, a number 4 here. I'm going to load it, I think, with my lemon yellow, which is the same I used for the base color of this belly. And I'm going to do what we did before with our fine lines. I'm going to get some harry this pigment quite a bit, get a brush that's quite thickly loaded with paint. And then I'm just going to have a play with putting a very fine overlay of color on here. You can always tell when it's something that requires concentration because my head comes crashing into the frame. What I'm doing here is I'm barely touching the paper at all, and so I'm not sure if it comes through on the webcam, but it's not a solid line. It's a very slightly bitty, slightly dotted line. Just gives the impression that this is coming through that plumage below.
What colour are you using there?
I'm using lemon yellow here, so it's the same that I used for the base of the belly here. It looks completely invisible on the webcam, so apologies for that. But just a very fine line, just to get some of that really exquisite sort of gold webbing that we've got going on. And I think to avoid us getting unceremoniously kicked out of Zoom, I might have to end it there. But as Leonardo da Vinci said, no work of art is ever finished, it's only abandoned. The nice thing I think about doing these is that we can add more and more to our picture the more we go on. We start off with these blocks of fairly disconnected color, and then as we join them, as we get them to greet each other, we end up with something that looks quite a lot like our picture. And of course, there are more things to do. There are always more things to do. I was going to add some legs in here. We can add a branch in here with some stippling, I reckon, if you remember from last class, just to get this sort of rough texture of the wood like we did before. And there's some more that we can finish up with a small brush just to finesse the texture of the head here. So I hope you all enjoyed that. Carol, I hope that was enjoyable for you. Of course, I'm afraid I can't let you go without asking to see everyone's pictures. So if you could hold them up, that would be great. Oh, fantastic. Aren't these exquisite? Those are all really, really nice. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very
Thank you
much.
very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Felix.
Well, I think all that remains for me to say in the minute or so that we have left is that I hope you all have a very lovely week. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you
Thank
very
you.
much.
Happy
Take care.
Easter to everyone.
Thank you. Happy
Wow.
Easter
Yeah,
to you
happy
too.
Easter.
Happy Easter.
Happy Easter.
Bye.
Bye.